Hey there! Before we kick off today's story, we'd really appreciate it if you'd hit that subscribe button, give us a thumbs up, and drop a quick comment below. It could be anything, even just letting us know where you're tuning in from. Your support means everything, helps our content spread further, and we'll make sure to respond to every single comment. Ready to dive in? Let's get started. Story 1. Why you wouldn't last a day as a Jew in the Middle Ages. The first rays of dawn crept through the narrow slits of your wooden shutters, barely illuminating the cramped room where you knelt in prayer. As a Jew in medieval Europe, your day began with the Shema, the sacred declaration of faith whispered in Hebrew, a ritual that grounded you in a world that seemed determined to crush you. The words felt like a shield, a fleeting moment of peace before the weight of the day descended. You murmured the ancient verses, your voice low, careful not to wake the neighbors who might report you for the crime of being yourself. The air was thick with the scent of stale bread and the faint tang of fear that never quite left you. Every morning was a gamble. Would today bring a knock at the door, a hurled stone, or worse? The tranquility of prayer was a cruel illusion, shattered by the ever-present dread of what lay beyond your threshold. A single misstep, a whispered rumor, or an envious glance could unravel your life. You rose from your knees, your heart pounding, knowing that survival demanded vigilance. The world outside was not yours. It was a labyrinth of hostility, and you were marked from the moment you stepped into it. Your clothing betrayed you before you even spoke. By law, you were forced to wear a badge of shame, a yellow circle stitched onto your cloak, or perhaps a pointed hat, the Judenhut, that screamed your difference to every passerby. In some towns, it was a red cloak or a blue stripe. In others, a star-shaped patch that burned against your chest like a brand. These were not mere symbols, they were targets. The church and the crown decreed these markers to ensure you could never blend in, never escape the gaze of those who saw you as less than human. Walking through the muddy streets, you felt the weight of every stare, each one a potential threat. A merchant might spit at your feet, a child might hurl a stone, and a priest might cross himself as if your very presence were a curse. The badge was a constant reminder. You were not one of them, and they would never let you forget it. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council had cemented these laws, declaring that Jews must be visibly distinct, their difference a public spectacle. To remove the badge was to invite death, but to wear it was to walk with a bullseye on your back. Every step was a calculation. Avoid the crowded market, steer clear of the cathedral square, and pray the local lord wasn't in a foul mood. Your home was no sanctuary either. You lived in the Jewish quarter, a walled ghetto where the gates were locked at night, trapping you inside like a prisoner. The streets were narrow, the houses packed so tightly that you could hear your neighbors' whispered prayers through the thin walls. Venice's ghetto in the 16th century was one of the first to bear the name, but even centuries earlier, cities across Europe, Frankfurt, Prague, Toledo, had their own versions. These were not neighborhoods, they were cages. The walls were high, the gates guarded, and the curfew was absolute. If you were caught outside after dark, you risked a beating or worse. The air was heavy with the stench of overcrowding, and the wells were often foul, yet you had no choice but to drink. The ghetto was a world apart, a place where you were both protected and imprisoned. You could hear the laughter and music from the Christian districts, but here, joy was tempered by caution. A loud celebration might draw suspicion, a gathering might be mistaken for a conspiracy. You learned to live quietly, to shrink into the shadows, because the alternative was to invite the mob. Your livelihood was another battle. The guilds barred you from most trades, blacksmithing, weaving, farming, leaving you with scraps of opportunity. In many places, you were forbidden to own land, so agriculture was a dream beyond reach. Instead, you were funneled into roles the church deemed too sinful for Christians: money lending, tax collecting, or petty trade. These were dangerous occupations, not because of the work itself, but because they made you a lightning rod for resentment. When a debtor couldn't pay, they didn't blame their own misfortune, they blamed you. The stereotype of the greedy Jew was born from these restrictions, a cruel irony since you had no choice but to fill the roles others refused. Some Jews became physicians, their skill sought after even by nobles, but even this was a tightrope. A successful cure might earn you a grudging nod. A patient's death could spark accusations of poisoning. In 1349, a Jewish doctor in Aragon was tortured until he confessed to causing the plague, his broken body paraded as proof of your people's malevolence. Every coin you earned came with a shadow of danger, and every transaction was a potential spark for violence. The church was the architect of much of this hatred. From the pulpits, priests thundered that Jews were the killers of Christ, a charge that branded you with the sin of deicide. This wasn't just theology, it was a call to arms. The accusation was rooted in scripture, twisted to fit the narrative, and it fueled centuries of violence. In 1096, during the First Crusade, mobs in the Rhineland slaughtered thousands of Jews, inspired by sermons that painted you as enemies of God. The church's decrees were relentless. Jews were barred from public office, forbidden from eating with Christians, and excluded from universities. The Fourth Lateran Council didn't just mandate badges, it forbade Jews from appearing in public during Holy Week lest their presence defile the sacred days. Every sermon was a reminder that you were an outcast in God's world, your existence a stain to be erased. The weight of this hatred pressed down on you daily, a reminder that even your faith, the core of your identity, was a crime in their eyes. Worse still were the blood libels, grotesque lies that spread like wildfire. In 1144 in Norwich, England, a boy named William was found dead, and the townsfolk accused the Jews of murdering him for a ritual sacrifice. The story was absurd. Judaism strictly forbids human sacrifice, but it didn't matter. The lie took root, and soon every missing child, every unexplained death was blamed on you. In 1255, in Lincoln, a boy named Hugh was found in a well, and the Jews were accused of killing him to use his blood in Passover rituals. 91 Jews were arrested, 18 executed, their bodies left to rot as a warning. These accusations weren't isolated. They erupted across Europe. Trent in 1475, Blois in 1171, each one sparking pogroms that left entire communities in ashes. You lived with the knowledge that any child's cry could become a death sentence, that a single rumor could ignite a mob. The fear was a constant companion, gnawing at you as you tucked your own children into bed, praying they'd never be the next victim in a fabricated tale. Pogroms were not just riots, they were spectacles of destruction, often sanctioned by the powerful. In 1349 in Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in a single day, accused of spreading the Black Death. The local council had debated their fate, but the mob didn't wait for a verdict. They stormed the ghetto, dragging men, women, and children to the pyre. The flames were a public event, watched by cheering crowds who looted what little the victims left behind. In 1298, in Rüttingen, Germany, a nobleman named Rindfleisch led a crusade against Jews, wiping out 146 communities in 6 months. These were not spontaneous outbursts. They were orchestrated, fueled by greed, and cloaked in righteousness. The authorities often turned a blind eye, or worse, joined in, seizing Jewish property as restitution. You lived knowing that any crisis, a bad harvest, a plague, a war, could turn your neighbors into executioners, their torches lighting up the night. The Black Death was a particularly brutal chapter. When the plague swept through Europe in the 1340s, killing millions, the Jews were an easy scapegoat. Rumors spread that you had poisoned the wells, a lie that justified massacres across the continent. In Basel, Jews were locked in a wooden building on an island and burned alive. In Freiburg, they were forced to confess under torture before being executed. In Cologne, the ghetto was set ablaze, the screams of the dying drowned out by the crackle of flames. You couldn't reason with the mob, couldn't prove your innocence when the accusation itself was proof enough. The plague didn't discriminate, but the hatred did. Your community buried its dead in secret, mourning in whispers, because even grief could be seen as defiance. The survivors were left to rebuild on ashes, knowing the next disaster would bring the same accusations. If you were caught practicing your faith, the Inquisition awaited. Established in the 13th century and reaching its peak in Spain by the 15th century, the Inquisition was a machine of terror. You might be accused of Judaizing, secretly practicing Judaism after a forced conversion. The trials were a farce, no evidence was needed, and torture extracted confessions that were as inevitable as they were false. In 1481 in Seville, 6 conversos were burned at the stake, their deaths a public warning to others. You could renounce your faith, but even that wasn't enough. Conversos were watched, their every move scrutinized for signs of relapse. A skipped meal on a Christian fast day, a refusal to eat pork, or a Hebrew prayer overheard could land you in a dungeon. The lucky ones died quickly, others lingered in agony, their bodies broken by the rack or the strappado. You lived with the knowledge that your faith, your heritage, was a death sentence waiting to be pronounced. Conversion was often the only path to survival, but it was a trap. In 1391, pogroms swept through Spain, and thousands of Jews were given a choice, the cross or the sword. Many chose baptism hoping it would spare their families, but the stain of their Jewish blood never washed away. Conversos were called New Christians, but the term was a slur, spat with contempt. They were barred from universities, guilds, and public office, their loyalty forever suspect. In 1492, Spain's Catholic monarchs issued the Alhambra decree expelling all Jews who refused to convert. Those who stayed faced a life of paranoia, hiding their true selves while the Inquisition's shadow loomed. You might light Sabbath candles in a cellar, but one slip, a neighbor's suspicion, a servant's betrayal, could bring the inquisitors to your door. Conversion didn't save you, it just delayed the inevitable. Expulsion was another constant threat. In 1290, England banished its Jews, giving them weeks to sell their homes and flee. In 1306, France followed, and again in 1394, each time stripping Jews of their possessions. Spain's expulsion in 1492 was the most infamous, with 200,000 Jews forced to leave their homes, their lives reduced to what they could carry. You had no say, no appeal. The decrees came suddenly and you were expected to vanish as if you'd never existed. Those who lingered were hunted like animals, their bodies left in ditches as a warning. The journey was its own peril. Bandits preyed on refugees and foreign lands offered no welcome. You walked with your children clinging to you, their eyes wide with fear, knowing that nowhere was truly safe. Your children grew up in a world that taught them silence. They learned to hide their Hebrew names, to avoid speaking Yiddish in public, to conceal the mezuzah on your doorframe. A single mistake, a Hebrew prayer overheard, a Star of David glimpsed could doom your entire family. You taught them to memorize prayers in secret, to whisper their heritage in the dark. They played quietly, their laughter muted, because noise drew attention. In some towns, Jewish children were kidnapped and baptized, their parents powerless to reclaim them. The church called it salvation. You called it theft. Your daughter might tug at your sleeve, asking why the other children threw stones, and you had no answer that didn't break your heart. They grew up fast. their childhood stolen by the need to survive. Violence was a public spectacle. In 1263 in Barcelona, a mob attacked the Jewish quarter, beating men in the streets and looting their homes. Women were not spared. Rape was a weapon, used to humiliate and destroy. In 1348 in Toledo, a pogrom left hundreds dead, their bodies piled in the streets as a warning. The authorities rarely intervened. Sometimes they joined in, their hands stained with the same blood as the mob's. You learned to avoid public squares on Christian holidays when drunken crowds sought scapegoats. A wrong glance, a perceived slight, could spark a beating. Your possessions were never truly yours. Looters could claim them with impunity, knowing no one would defend you. You walked with your head down, your shoulders hunched, praying to go unnoticed, but the yellow badge made invisibility impossible. Your faith, the heart of your identity, was driven underground. Synagogues were often hidden, tucked away in basements or behind false walls. In 1391, after the pogroms in Seville, many Jews worshipped in secret, their prayers muffled by fear. You lit candles in the dark, recited the Torah in whispers, and buried sacred texts to keep them safe. The Sabbath was a risk. Lighting candles or refraining from work could betray you to a watchful neighbor. Yet you clung to these rituals because they were all you had left. The synagogue was more than a place of worship. It was a defiance, a refusal to let your heritage be erased. Every prayer was an act of courage. Every Hebrew word a rebellion against a world that wanted you gone. And yet, despite it all, you survived. Your people endured, carrying their faith through centuries of blood and fire. The Middle Ages were a crucible, testing the limits of human resilience, and the Jewish people emerged unbroken. They preserved their language, their traditions, their stories, passing them down in whispers and hidden scrolls. In the face of pogroms, expulsions, and inquisitions, they rebuilt, they adapted, they remembered. You, standing in their shoes, might not have lasted a day, overwhelmed by the weight of hatred and the constant shadow of death. But they did. They carried the weight of 1,000 years, their survival a testament to a spirit that refused to be crushed. Their legacy is not just survival, but defiance, a refusal to let the world's cruelty define them. In every hidden prayer, every whispered story, they carved out a space for hope, a light that no darkness could extinguish. Story 2, A Day in Auschwitz, the routine of dehumanization. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, urine, and fear as the cattle car lurched to a stop, its iron wheels screeching against the tracks. You had been packed inside for days, maybe 3, maybe 5. Time had blurred into a haze of thirst and suffocation. The wooden slats of the train offered no windows, only slivers of light that barely pierced the darkness. There were no seats, no toilets, just bodies pressed so tightly against one another that you could scarcely breathe. The elderly woman beside you had stopped moving hours ago, her head slumped against your shoulder, her breath gone. You didn't dare speak of it. The others, packed like sardines, were too weak or too terrified to notice. Babies wailed until their voices gave out, and the bucket in the corner, meant to serve as a latrine, had overflowed long ago, its contents seeping into the straw-strewn floor. You clutched the small bundle of belongings, a photograph of your family, a pair of glasses, a scrap of bread you'd saved, knowing they were all you had left of the world you'd been torn from. The train's sudden halt jolted you forward, and the doors were flung open with a clang, letting in a blast of cold air and the barking of dogs. You were in Auschwitz, though no one told you that. All you knew was the chaos that awaited outside. Stepping onto the platform, the Juden ramp, You were met with a wall of noise, shouts in German, the snarling of Alsatians straining at their leashes, and the cries of those around you. SS officers in crisp uniforms stood like vultures, their eyes cold and unyielding as they barked orders. "Raus! Raus! Schnell!" You stumbled out, your legs numb from days of standing, your body weak from hunger and dehydration. The platform was a sea of confusion, a mass of disoriented men, women, and children, blinking against the harsh light. Soldiers prodded you with rifle butts, their voices sharp as they demanded you move faster. You clung to your family, your hand gripping your mother's, your sister's small fingers trembling in yours. But the crowd was already being torn apart, pushed into lines without explanation. You didn't know where you were, only that the air smelled of smoke and something acrid you couldn't place. The platform was a stage for terror, and you were its unwilling performer, herded forward under the watchful eyes of men who saw you as less than human. The separation came swiftly, like a blade through flesh. Men to one side, women and children to another, no time for goodbyes, no chance to protest. You tried to hold on to your sister, but a soldier's gloved hand shoved you apart, his shout drowning out her cry. Your mother was pulled away, her scarf slipping to the ground as she was forced into a different line. You called out, but your voice was lost in the cacophony. Families dissolved around you, husbands torn from wives, children ripped from parents' arms. The SS didn't care for your pleas. They saw only numbers, not people. You stood alone now, a man in your 20s, your heart pounding as you scanned the crowd for a glimpse of your family, but they were gone, swallowed by the chaos. You didn't know it yet, but for many, this was the last moment they'd see their loved ones. The platform was a cruel threshold, stripping you of everything familiar before you even understood what was happening. Then came the selection, a moment so brief, yet so final. You stood in a line, shivering in the dawn chill, as an SS officer, perhaps Dr. Joseph Mengele himself, surveyed you with a flick of his baton. His eyes were clinical, assessing you in seconds. To the right meant life, or at least a temporary reprieve. To the left meant death. You were young, strong enough to stand upright despite the journey, so you were sent right toward the labor camp. Others weren't so lucky. The elderly man who'd shared his water with you on the train, the woman with the newborn, the boy who'd clung to his mother's skirt. They were directed left, toward a path that led to the gas chambers. You didn't know their fate yet, but the air felt heavier as they disappeared, their footsteps echoing in your memory. The selection was a lottery of cruelty, decided by men who held your life in their hands and cared nothing for it. You moved forward, your heart a knot of dread, wondering if you'd made a mistake by looking strong, by surviving the first cut. Your possessions were next to go. Soldiers ordered you to empty your pockets, to surrender everything you'd carried. Your photograph, your glasses, the ring your father had given you, they were torn from your hands, tossed into piles to be sorted and sold. The Nazis were meticulous, cataloguing every item for profit. Gold teeth were pried from mouths, wedding bands stripped from fingers. Women's hair, shorn later, would be woven into cloth or stuffed into mattresses. Your bundle, so carefully packed, was now just another piece of loot in the Third Reich's machine. You stood empty-handed, stripped of the last remnants of your past. The act was not just theft, it was erasure, a deliberate stripping away of your humanity. You were no longer a person with a history, a family, a name. You were a resource to be exploited, and the Nazis made sure you felt it. The humiliation deepened as you were herded into a barrack and ordered to strip. Naked, You stood among strangers, men of all ages, their faces etched with shame and fear. The guards laughed, their voices mocking as they prodded you forward. There was no privacy, no dignity, just the cold gaze of men who saw you as vermin. Women in another barrack faced the same ordeal, their cries muffled through the thin walls. This was the first step in breaking you, in reducing you to a body without identity. The air was damp, the floor slick with grime, and the smell of sweat and fear was inescapable. You tried to cover yourself, but there was no hiding from the guards' eyes or the weight of their contempt. Your clothes, your last connection to the person you'd been, were gone, replaced by the promise of something worse. Then came the shaving, a brutal ritual of dehumanization. A guard, his hands rough and impatient, ran a dull blade over your scalp, scraping away your hair with no regard for your skin. Blood trickled from nicks and cuts, but there was no time to flinch. The same blade was used on everyone, spreading lice and infection. Your beard, if you had one, was hacked off. Even your pubic hair was shaved, the blade tearing at sensitive skin. The Nazis called it disinfection, but it was punishment, designed to strip you of individuality. You looked around and saw men transformed into ghosts, their heads bald, their faces unfamiliar even to themselves. The women, you'd hear later, endured the same, their long braids falling to the floor, collected for profit. You touched your scalp, raw and stinging, and felt the first crack in your sense of self. You were no longer you, just a body, marked for suffering. The tattoo came next, a permanent brand of your new reality. A guard seized your left arm, and with a needle and ink, he etched a number into your skin. The pain was sharp, but the meaning was sharper. Your name was gone. You were now Wolfgang 7832, or whatever sequence they assigned you. Auschwitz was unique in this practice. Other camps used badges or lists, but here the number was carved into your flesh, a constant reminder that you were no longer human. You stared at the crude digits, the ink blurring with blood, and felt a piece of yourself slip away. The guard didn't look at you. He was already moving to the next man, his needle dripping. You wanted to scream your name, to cling to it, but the act of speaking could earn you a blow. So you stood silent, the number burning into your soul as much as your skin. They handed you a uniform, if it could be called that, a tattered set of striped pajamas, or perhaps a mismatched collection of civilian clothes stained and worn. The fabric was thin, useless against the Polish winter, and the sizes were arbitrary. Your shirt hung loose, your trousers too tight, and the wooden clogs they gave you rubbed blisters into your feet. There were no socks, no underwear, just the rough scrape of cloth against your raw skin. You looked at the others, all dressed in the same ill-fitting rags, and saw a uniformity that erased individuality. The stripes were a badge of servitude, a signal to the world that you were a prisoner, a subhuman. You pulled the fabric tighter, trying to find warmth, but there was none. The clogs slipped as you walked, and you knew they'd be useless in the mud and snow of the camp. The barrack was your next destination, a wooden shed packed with hundreds of men. The air inside was stale, heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies and despair. You were assigned a bunk, a narrow plank of wood shared with 2 or 3 others. There were no mattresses, no blankets, just the splintered surface and the press of bodies for warmth. The barrack was alive with coughs, groans, and the rustle of restless sleep. Rats skittered across the floor, and the roof leaked, dripping icy water onto your face. You lay there, your body aching from the train, your mind racing with questions you couldn't answer. Where was your family? What was this place? The man beside you whispered his name, as if to hold on to it, but you didn't respond. You were too exhausted, too afraid to speak. Sleep was a distant hope. interrupted by the cold and the fear of what tomorrow would bring. Before dawn, the guards woke you with shouts and blows. It was time for the appel, the roll call. You stumbled outside, still groggy, and lined up in the freezing dark. The wind cut through your thin uniform and your clogs sank into the mud. You stood for hours, counted and recounted, as the SS ensured no one had escaped. If a number was missing, you stood longer, sometimes until men collapsed from exhaustion or hypothermia. The guards didn't care. A prisoner who fell was beaten or shot, his body left as a warning. You stood rigid, your legs trembling, praying your number would be called correctly. One mistake, an error in the count, a mispronounced digit, could mean a whip across your back or a bullet to your head. The sky lightened, but the cold didn't relent, and neither did the guards' cruelty. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was a bowl of watery slop, labeled soup, but tasting of nothing but dirt and decay. It might have been made from potato peels or rotten turnips, but you couldn't tell. A crust of bread, hard as stone, was your only other sustenance. You forced it down, your stomach growling for more, but there was nothing else. The portion was barely enough to keep you alive, let alone sustain the labor that awaited. You saw men fight over crumbs, their desperation turning them against each other. You clutched your bread tightly, knowing it might be all you'd get for the day. The guards watched, amused, as you scrambled for scraps. Hunger was another weapon, one they wielded with precision. Then came the work, a grueling march to the factories or quarries. You were assigned to a labor detail, perhaps hauling bricks or digging in the frozen earth. The guards stood over you, their rifles ready, their whips cracking at the slightest sign of slowness. You worked until your hands bled, your muscles screaming, but stopping wasn't an option. A man beside you collapsed, and the guard beat him until he lay still, his blood soaking into the ground. You kept moving, your eyes fixed on the task, because looking up could draw attention. The work was meaningless, designed to break you, not to build anything lasting. You heard rumors of factories like IG Farben, where prisoners produced chemicals for the Nazi war machine, their lives expendable. Every step was a battle against exhaustion, every moment a fight to stay alive. Punishment was a constant threat. A guard might decide you looked at him wrong or that you moved too slowly. The punishment could be a beating, a lash across your face, or worse, public execution. You saw it happen that first day. A man who spoke out of turn was dragged to the center of the camp and hanged, his body left swinging as a lesson. The guards wanted you to see, to understand that resistance was futile. Every act of cruelty was calculated, designed to instill fear and break your spirit. You learned quickly to keep your head down, to move silently, to obey without question. But even obedience wasn't enough. The rules were arbitrary, the punishments random. You lived in a world where a guard's mood could mean your death. The fear of death was your constant companion. It wasn't just the gas chambers, though their shadow loomed over everything. Death could come from a guard's whim, a beating gone too far, or the slow grind of starvation and disease. You saw it in the faces of the men around you, hollow eyes, sunken cheeks, bodies wasting away. You heard it in the coughs that echoed through the barrack, the first signs of typhus or tuberculosis. Every day brought new selections where the SS culled the weak, sending them to the chambers or shooting them on the spot. You lived with the knowledge that your strength, your youth, was only a temporary shield. Tomorrow, or the day after, you might be too slow, too sick, too unlucky. The smoke from the crematoria never stopped rising, a constant reminder of what awaited. You didn't know if your family was already gone, their ashes mingling with the grey sky. All you knew was that you had to survive this day, this hour, this moment, and even that felt impossible. Story 3, you wouldn't survive a day as a Jew in Nazi Germany. The moment you opened your eyes in the morning, the weight of your existence pressed down on you. You were a Jew in Nazi Germany, and that alone made you an enemy of the state, a target in a nation that had declared your very being a crime. It wasn't something you did or said, it was who you were. The year is 1938 and the air is thick with dread as you rise from your bed in a small apartment in Berlin, the city you once called home. The streets outside buzz with the hum of a society turning against you, and every choice you make today will be a gamble between survival and annihilation. You pull on your coat, careful to ensure the yellow star with the word Jude is securely sewn onto it, and step into a world that wants you erased. Your day begins with the knowledge that you are no longer a citizen. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 stripped you of that right, reducing you to a second-class status that feels more like no status at all. You can't marry a non-Jew, can't even sit too close to one without risking arrest. The laws are clear. You are not German, not in the eyes of the state. Your passport, if you still have one, is stamped with a red J to mark your shame. You remember the day the laws were announced, the way your neighbors' eyes shifted, some with pity, others with a gleam of satisfaction. You were a teacher once, respected in your community, but that life is gone. The Reich banned Jews from public office, from universities, from any profession that carried dignity. Lawyers, doctors, professors, all dismissed overnight, their careers reduced to ash because they weren't Aryan. You now scrape by as a peddler, selling odds and ends to the few who will still trade with you, but even that is precarious. The world you knew has been dismantled, and you're left navigating its ruins. Your children, if you have them, face their own torment. They were expelled from school years ago, forbidden from sitting in classrooms with German children. You can still hear your daughter's sobs as she came home with bruises on her arms, pushed and taunted by classmates who once shared their lunch with her. The teachers did nothing, some even joined in, calling her names that cut deeper than the blows. Now she studies at home, if you can call it that. Whispered lessons from tattered books you've hidden from the authorities. The Hitler Youth march past your window, their songs echoing through the street, and you pull the curtains tight, knowing your children are no longer safe outside. They've learned to walk with their heads down, to avoid eye contact, to hide who they are. But the yellow star on their coats betrays them, just as it betrays you. Your shop, if you were lucky enough to still have one, is a ghost of its former self. The boycott began in 1933 with SA stormtroopers standing outside Jewish businesses, their signs screaming, "Don't buy from Jews." Customers who once greeted you by name now crossed the street to avoid you. Your windows are smeared with paint, Jude scrawled in jagged letters, or worse, a swastika. Some mornings you find the glass shattered, your goods stolen or smashed. You can't call the police, they're the ones who let it happen, or worse, they wield the paint cans themselves. You tried to keep the business afloat, but the customers are gone, driven away by fear or hatred. The few who still come do so in secret, slipping in after dark, their faces tense with the risk of being seen. Your livelihood, built over years of hard work, is crumbling, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. The yellow star on your chest is your constant companion, a badge of humiliation you're forced to wear at all times. Decreed in 1938 in some regions and later enforced across the Reich, it marks you as a pariah. The star is bright, impossible to miss, and it draws eyes wherever you go. Strangers spit as you pass, children point and laugh, and young men in brown shirts smirk, their fists itching for a reason to strike. You've learned to avoid crowded streets, to take alleys and back routes, but even that's not enough. The star makes you a target, a walking invitation for abuse. You've seen others, old men, young women, beaten for no reason other than the star on their coat. You sew it on tightly, knowing that failing to wear it could mean arrest, but every stitch feels like a surrender, a piece of your dignity torn away. Getting around is a nightmare. You're banned from trams, buses, and trains. Public transportation is for Aryans only. If you need to see a doctor or visit a relative, you walk, no matter how far or how cold the weather. Your shoes are worn thin and the winter bites at your toes, but you have no choice. The streets are hostile, filled with posters vilifying you, caricatures of Jews with hooked noses and greedy hands plastered on every corner. You pass a park where you once took your children to play, but now it's off limits, a sign declaring no Jews allowed. Cafes, theaters, even benches are forbidden to you. You're a ghost in your own city, forced to move through it without belonging, your every step a reminder of your exclusion. The curfew is another chain. After 8 p.m., you're confined to your home, the doors locked, the windows shuttered. Violating the curfew means arrest or worse, a beating from the SA who patrol the streets. You've heard stories of Jews caught out late, their bodies found in alleys, their families too afraid to claim them. Even during the day, certain streets are off limits, marked by signs or the unspoken threat of violence. You plan your routes carefully, avoiding the areas where Hitler Youth gather or where the SS are known to linger. Your world has shrunk to a handful of safe paths, and even those feel like traps waiting to spring. You carry your identity card, stamped with that damning J, knowing it's both a shield and a noose. Violence is a constant shadow. You step outside and a group of young men in brown shirts spot you. They call you names, Saujude, Untermensch, and before you can turn away, a fist lands on your jaw. You stumble, tasting blood, but you don't fight back. Resistance only makes it worse. The police stand nearby watching with disinterest, or sometimes they join in, their batons cracking against your ribs. Your neighbors, people you've known for years, turn away, their silence as brutal as the blows. Your home isn't safe either. Last week, someone threw a brick through your window, the glass shattering across your floor. You swept it up in silence, knowing a complaint would go nowhere. The violence isn't just physical, it's the knowledge that no one will help, that the world has turned against you. Your faith, your culture is under siege. In 1933, the Nazis burned Jewish books in public squares, the flames consuming the works of Heine, Freud, and countless others. You hid your own books, the Torah and Talmud tucked under floorboards, but the fear of discovery gnaws at you. Synagogues are vandalized, their windows smashed, their sacred scrolls defaced. You used to pray openly, but now you whisper your prayers in the dark, the candles hidden behind curtains. The Nazis want to erase your heritage, to reduce your faith to ashes. You've heard of rabbis beaten for teaching, of children punished for speaking Yiddish. Your identity, the core of who you are, is a crime, and every moment you cling to it feels like defiance and danger. Then came the Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, on November 10, 1938. You woke to the sound of shattering glass and screams, the sky glowing orange from burning synagogues. Across Germany, 7,000 Jewish businesses were looted, their windows smashed, their goods stolen or destroyed. Over 1,400 synagogues were set ablaze, their flames a beacon of hatred. You hid in your apartment, your heart pounding as boots thundered outside. The SA stormed into homes, dragging men from their beds, beating them in front of their families. You heard your neighbor's cries as he was taken, his fate unknown. Thousands were arrested that night, sent to camps like Dachau, where torture and death awaited. You stayed quiet, praying the mob would pass you by, but the fear lingered long after the fires died down. Your city, your home, had become a battlefield, and you were its target. Paranoia is your constant companion. You can't trust anyone, not your neighbors, not your old friends, not even the shopkeeper who used to smile at you. Anyone could turn you in, report you for some imagined offense. A rumor that you hid money, that you spoke against the Führer, that you broke a curfew. It's enough to bring the Gestapo to your door. You've seen it happen, a colleague denounced by a co-worker, a family betrayed by a jealous neighbor. You speak less, smile less, avoid eye contact. Every knock at the door sends your pulse racing. Every letter in the mailbox a potential summons. You live in a world where trust is a luxury you can't afford, where every interaction is a risk. The camps are already a reality. Even in 1938, Dachau, Sachsenhausen, names whispered in terror. Jews, especially men, are rounded up for protective custody, a euphemism for imprisonment without trial. You've heard the stories: beatings, starvation, executions disguised as accidents. If you're taken, you might not come back. The camps are the beginning of the Nazis' machine of death, a testing ground for the horrors to come. You know of men who were arrested for nothing, owning a radio, attending a synagogue, or simply being in the wrong place. The fear of the camps hangs over you, a shadow that darkens every moment. You wonder if today will be the day they come for you, if your name is already on a list. Your rights have been stripped away one by one. You can't vote, can't open a bank account, can't own a pet. Your telephone was confiscated, your radio too. Your life is being erased piece by piece until you're left with nothing but fear. The laws are relentless, each one tightening the noose. You can't sit on certain benches, can't shop at certain hours, can't even walk your dog without breaking some obscure regulation. The Nazis have made your existence illegal, reducing you to a shadow of a person. You carry your identity card, but it's a document of condemnation, proof of your status as an outcast. Every day, another right is taken, another door closed, until you're left with nothing but the walls of your shrinking world. And yet the worst is always looming. You know you're being hunted. The deportations have begun, families rounded up, their homes seized, their lives erased. You've heard of trains leaving in the night, packed with people who never return. The Nazis don't hide their intentions. Their propaganda screams of a Jew-free Germany. You live with the constant dread that today could be the day. A knock at the door, a shouted order, and you're gone. Your family torn apart, your home left empty. No one will stop it. Not the police, not your neighbors, not the world. You try to plan, to hide money or papers, but there's nowhere to go. The borders are closing and the world is turning its back. You're trapped, a prisoner, in your own country, waiting for the inevitable. You wouldn't survive a day, not because you lack courage, but because the machine of hatred is relentless and it was built to destroy you. Story 4, a day in the Warsaw Ghetto. Resist or die. The dawn broke over the Warsaw Ghetto in April 1943, a grey light filtering through the cracks of your cramped apartment, where the air was thick with the smell of mold and despair. You woke to the sound of boots on cobblestones, a sound that had become as familiar as your own heartbeat. The ghetto was a prison without bars, its 3-meter-high walls topped with barbed wire, trapping over 400,000 Jews in a sliver of the city, a mere 2.4% of Warsaw's area. Your home, if you could call it that, was a single room shared with your parents, your younger sister, and 2 other families. 10 people in a space meant for 2. The walls were thin, the floor cold, and the constant hum of suffering seeped through every crack. You stepped carefully over the sleeping forms of your neighbors, their faces gaunt from hunger, their eyes hollow from months of watching death creep closer. Outside, the ghetto was a maze of overcrowded streets where skeletal children begged for scraps and bodies lay unclaimed on the sidewalks. Today, though, was different. Today, the air crackled with something new, not just fear, but defiance. The Nazis were coming to finish what they started, and you, along with a handful of others, had decided to fight back. Hunger was your constant companion, a gnawing ache that never relented. The Nazis allotted you less than 300 calories a day, less than a tenth of what a person needs to survive. Breakfast, if you were lucky, was a cup of watery soup made from grass or potato peels, its taste more like dirt than food. The bread, when it came, was hard as stone, often flecked with mold or sawdust. You broke it into tiny pieces, rationing it for your sister, who was too weak to stand some days. Starvation was a weapon, wielded with precision. You'd seen children collapse in the street, their bodies too frail to carry on, their mothers too broken to cry. Smugglers risked death to bring in scraps of food, but it was never enough. You'd learn to chew slowly, to savor every crumb, because there was no guarantee of another meal. The Nazis wanted you weak, pliable, but today that weakness was turning into something else, a burning resolve to resist, even if it meant dying on your own terms. The deportations had begun in the summer of 1942, a nightmare that tore the ghetto apart. The Nazis called it resettlement, promising better lives in the East, but the truth had seeped through like poison. Those trains weren't taking people to new homes, they were going to Treblinka, a death camp where men, women, and children were gassed within hours of arrival. You'd heard the whispers, the stories from those who'd escaped or bribed their way back. By April 1943, over 300,000 Jews had been deported from the ghetto, their homes left empty, their names erased. Your cousin was among them, taken in a roundup last September, his screams echoing as he was dragged to the Umschlagplatz, the loading square. You'd stood frozen, helpless, as he disappeared into the crowd. The truth was undeniable now. There was no resettlement, only death. That knowledge lit a fire in your chest, a refusal to go quietly, to let the Nazis dictate your end. The spark of resistance had been growing, fueled by desperation and a hunger for dignity. Young men and women, barely out of their teens, had formed the Żydowska Organizacja Bojowa, the Jewish Combat Organization, or JOB. Led by Mordecai Anilowicz, a 24-year-old, with fire in his eyes, they were your neighbors, your friends, people who decided that if death was coming, they'd meet it with a fight. You joined them not because you thought you could win, but because submission was no longer an option. The Jobbie was small, maybe a few hundred strong, but their resolve was unbreakable. You met in secret, in basements and attics, whispering plans under the cover of darkness. Anielewicz' words stuck with you. We may die, but we will not be slaves. You weren't a soldier, but you were ready to fight, to reclaim some shred of humanity in a place designed to strip it away. Weapons were scarce, each one a treasure smuggled at unimaginable risk. The Jobbie had managed to sneak in a handful of pistols, a few rifles, and some homemade grenades, crude bombs made from bottles and gunpowder. You'd helped carry a sack of cocktail Molotov, your hands trembling as you passed them through a sewer grate, praying the Polish resistance on the outside wouldn't betray you. Every weapon was a symbol, proof that you were no longer just victims. You trained in secret, learning to aim a pistol with shaking hands to light a fuse without flinching. The arsenal was pitiful compared to the Nazis' machine guns and tanks, but it was enough to make a stand. You clutched a rusty revolver now, hidden under your coat, its weight both a burden and a promise. Today, you'd use it, or you'd die trying. The rebellion erupted on April 19, 1943, as the Nazis marched into the ghetto to round up the last of its inhabitants. You stood at a window, your heart pounding, watching their grey uniforms fill the street below. They expected compliance, the same broken spirits they'd crushed for years. Instead, they were met with gunfire. You fired your revolver, the recoil jarring your arm, and saw a soldier stagger. From rooftops and alleys, your comrades attacked, Molotovs raining down, shattering into flames, pistols cracking from shattered windows. The Nazis, caught off guard, scrambled for cover, their shouts of surprise drowned out by explosions. For the first time, you saw fear in their eyes, and it felt like victory, however fleeting. The ghetto had become a battlefield, and you were no longer just a prisoner. You were a fighter. The fighting was brutal, a desperate dance through the streets and ruins. You moved from building to building, slipping through alleys and climbing over rubble. The ghetto's maze was your only advantage, its narrow streets and crumbling tenements, a labyrinth the Nazis didn't know. You fired from a second-story window, ducked as bullets splintered the wood around you, then ran to the next hiding spot. Sewers became your highways, their dank tunnels a refuge where you could regroup and plan. You fought alongside a girl named Rachel, barely 18, who hurled a grenade with deadly precision before a bullet caught her in the chest. You dragged her body to safety, her blood staining your hands, and kept fighting, because stopping meant surrender. The Nazis were relentless, but so were you, driven by a fury that had been building for years. The civilian population, those not fighting, were caught in the crossfire. Many hid in bunkers, cramped, airless spaces dug beneath floors or hidden behind false walls. You'd helped build one, piling dirt in the dark, knowing it might be your only chance to survive. Your sister was there now, huddled with your parents, their faces pale in the candlelight. You'd promised to come back for them, but the streets were an inferno. The Nazis, enraged by the resistance, began setting buildings ablaze, block by block. Smoke choked the air and screams echoed as families were burned alive in their hiding places. You saw a mother clutching her child, trapped in a flaming doorway, her cries cutting through you like a knife. You wanted to help, but bullets were flying, and you had to keep moving. The ghetto was a death trap, and every choice was a gamble between life and annihilation. Mordecai Anielewicz was the heart of the resistance, his courage a beacon in the chaos. At 24, he carried the weight of a leader, his voice steady even as the odds mounted against you. You'd seen him in the streets, rallying fighters, his eyes burning with a mix of hope and fatalism. "It's better to die with honor than live as a slave," he'd said, and you clung to those words as you reloaded your pistol. He fought from a bunker at Mila 18, coordinating attacks, sending runners through the sewers to deliver messages. You'd carried one of his orders, a scrap of paper, urging you to hold a street corner until reinforcements arrived. They never did. Later, you'd hear he died in that bunker, surrounded by Nazis, his last stand a testament to his refusal to yield. His death was a blow, but it didn't break you, it fueled you, because his fight was yours. The Nazi response was merciless. They brought in tanks, their treads crushing the cobblestones, and flamethrowers that turned homes into pyres. Soldiers went house by house, tossing grenades into bunkers, shooting anyone who emerged. You saw a friend, Isaac, captured and lined up against a wall, his hands raised before a bullet ended him. The executions were public, designed to terrify. You hid in a cellar, your breath shallow as boots stomped overhead. The Nazis didn't just want to crush the resistance, they wanted to erase the ghetto, to leave no trace of its people. You heard the roar of artillery, the crash of collapsing buildings, and knew the end was coming. Yet you fought on because every shot you fired was a refusal to let them win without a cost. By May, the ghetto was a wasteland. The Nazis had burned or bombed nearly every building, leaving a landscape of smoldering rubble and ash. The Great Synagogue, a symbol of Jewish life, was dynamited, its ruins a final insult. You stumbled through the debris, your revolver empty, your body aching from days without food or rest. The resistance was crumbling, but it had lasted weeks, weeks of defiance against an enemy that expected surrender. You found a tunnel, a last escape route, and slipped into the sewers with a handful of survivors. The darkness was suffocating, the water foul, but it was your only chance. Above, the ghetto was gone, its streets silent except for the crackle of dying fires. The uprising was a military failure, but its impact was seismic. You'd shown the world that Jews could fight, that even in the face of genocide, there was a choice: resist or die. The Nazis paid a price. Hundreds of soldiers wounded or killed, their plans disrupted by a ragtag group of fighters armed with little more than courage. The story of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising spread, a spark of hope in a world consumed by darkness. In America, it would later be taught in schools, a lesson in the power of resistance against tyranny. You didn't know that then, crawling through the sewers, your sister's hand in yours, but you felt it, the weight of what you'd done. You'd fought not just for survival, but for the right to be remembered as a person, not a victim. The legacy of the uprising lived on in those who survived. Some, like you, escaped through the sewers, finding refuge with the Polish underground or in hiding. Others were captured, sent to Treblinka or Majdanek, their fates sealed. But the survivors carried the story forward, their testimonies shaping the trials of Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg and beyond. You'd tell your story one day if you lived, not as a tale of defeat, but as proof of defiance. The Warsaw Ghetto was gone, its people murdered or scattered, but its spirit endured. You fought because you had to, because surrender meant erasure. And in that fight, you became part of something eternal, a testament to the human will to resist, even when all hope is lost. Story 5. You wouldn't last a day being Jewish in ancient Jerusalem. The first light of dawn crept over the hills of Judea, casting a faint glow on the stone walls of your modest home in Jerusalem. But the peace of morning was a fleeting illusion. As a Jew in the time of the Second Temple, around 66 AD, you rose before sunrise, your breath visible in the cool air, to pray facing the temple, the beating heart of your faith. The words of the Shema spilled from your lips, a whispered declaration of devotion, but the sanctity of the moment was tainted by dread. The Temple Mount loomed in the distance, its golden stones a symbol of hope, yet the air carried whispers of unrest. Roman soldiers on the streets, rumors of rebellion, and the ever-present threat of violence. You finished your prayer, your voice barely above a murmur, knowing that today, like every day, survival would demand every ounce of your cunning and courage. Jerusalem was a city on the edge, and as a Jew, you were caught in a storm of oppression, division, and impending doom. The streets were already alive with the clatter of Roman boots, their armor glinting as they patrolled the narrow alleys of the lower city. You stepped outside, your sandals scuffing against the dust, and felt their eyes on you, cold, unyielding, searching for any excuse to strike. The Romans ruled Judea with an iron fist, their presence a constant reminder that you were not free. A misstep, a glance held too long, could land you in chains or worse, nailed to a cross. You passed a centurion, his hand resting on the hilt of his gladius, and lowered your eyes, your heart pounding. You'd heard stories of neighbors dragged from their homes for speaking out of turn, their families left to mourn in silence. The Romans didn't need evidence. Suspicion was enough. You kept your head down, weaving through the crowded market, where merchants whispered nervously and mothers clutched their children close. Every corner held a threat, every shadow a potential betrayer. The weight of Rome's taxes crushed you daily. You worked long hours as a weaver, your fingers raw from the loom, but the coin you earned was never enough. Rome demanded tribute, a heavy tithe that left your family hungry. The temple authorities, too, required their share, offerings for the priests, contributions for the upkeep of the sacred site. And then there were the local rulers, men like the Herodian tax collectors, who skimmed their own profits, their greed as oppressive as Rome's. You'd seen families forced to sell their land, their children, just to pay what was owed. Your own pantry was nearly bare, a single jar of lentils and a loaf of coarse barley bread, all you had to feed your wife and 2 daughters. You rationed every bite, knowing that tomorrow might bring nothing. The market stalls were sparse, the prices inflated by scarcity and fear. Hunger was a constant companion, and the Romans knew it. They starved you to keep you weak, to keep you compliant. Justice was a myth under Roman rule. If a Roman accused you of a crime, stealing, disrespect, or simply existing too boldly, you had no defense. Their courts were a farce, presided over by magistrates who saw Jews as vermin. A neighbor, falsely accused of insulting a soldier, was flogged until his back was a mass of blood, his cries echoing through the night. You'd seen others sentenced to crucifixion, their trials lasting minutes, their guilt assumed. The Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, had ruled Judea with particular cruelty decades earlier, setting a precedent for brutality that lingered. You carried a small scroll of prayers tucked into your cloak, but even that felt dangerous. Possession of religious texts could be twisted into sedition. You avoided the Roman fortress of Antonia, where prisoners were held, their screams a warning to the city. There was no law for you, only the sword. Your own people were as divided as the city was tense. The Pharisees argued for strict adherence to the Torah, clashing with the Sadducees, who controlled the temple and collaborated with Rome. The Zealots, fiery and uncompromising, called for rebellion, their knives flashing in the shadows. You sympathized with the Zealots' rage but feared their recklessness. Their plots often ended in blood, not freedom. At the synagogue, debates raged. Should you submit to Rome, negotiate with the temple elite, or fight? You wanted to believe in unity, but the factions tore at each other, their voices drowning out hope. Your cousin, a Pharisee, refused to speak to a Sadducee friend, and your brother whispered of joining the Zealots, his eyes alight with dangerous dreams. The divisions weakened you all, making resistance feel like a fantasy in a city already buckling under Rome's heel. Rebellion was a spark that could ignite at any moment, but it came at a cost. You'd heard of small revolts crushed with savage efficiency, villages burned, leaders crucified, their bodies left to rot as a warning. In the alleys, you saw the aftermath, bloodstains on the stones, families mourning in secret. The Zealots struck at Roman patrols, their daggers swift, but the reprisals were merciless. Just last week, a group of rebels ambushed a centurion, only for the Romans to round up 10 men at random and execute them in the market square. You passed the crosses daily, their grim silhouettes a constant reminder of Rome's power. The bodies hung for days, their faces swollen, their eyes staring blankly at the city they dared to defy. You wanted to fight, to scream, but the sight of those crosses silenced you. Resistance was a death sentence, and yet submission felt like a betrayal of everything you believed. Crucifixion was Rome's favorite terror tactic, a spectacle designed to break you. The road to Jerusalem was lined with crosses, their victims a mix of rebels, thieves, and innocents caught in the wrong place. You passed them on your way to the market, the stench of death clinging to the air, the groans of the dying a sound you couldn't unhear. Your daughters, too young to understand, clung to your hands, their eyes wide with fear. You shielded them from the worst, but the crosses were everywhere, a message carved in blood. Defy Rome, and this is your fate. You'd seen a friend, a baker, who'd spoken against the taxes, nailed to a cross, his wife sobbing at his feet until soldiers drove her away. The Romans didn't care who they killed. Every body was a lesson, every death a warning. You walked faster, your heart heavy, knowing you could be next. The temple was the center of your world, but even that came at a cost. You were expected to offer sacrifices, lambs, doves, or grain, but the animals were expensive, the priests demanding payment you couldn't afford. What was once a sacred act of devotion now felt like a tax, another burden on a family already stretched thin. You brought a small offering, a handful of barley, and stood in the temple courtyard, the smoke of burning sacrifices thick in the air. The priests, clad in fine robes, barely glanced at you, their eyes on the wealthier worshippers. You prayed for strength, for deliverance, but the Roman soldiers stationed at the temple gates watched closely, their presence a desecration. The act of worship, once a source of joy, now carried a bitter edge, a reminder that even your faith was under siege. By 66 AD, the city was a powder keg. The Jewish revolt had begun, a desperate bid for freedom led by the zealots and others who could no longer bear Rome's yoke. You felt the stirrings of hope. Could this be the moment your people broke free? But hope was tempered by fear. The Romans were a machine of war, their legions unmatched. You joined a crowd in the temple courtyard, listening to a zealot leader call for fight, his voice rising over the murmurs of doubt. Some cheered, others wept, torn between the dream of liberation and the dread of retaliation. You wanted to believe, but you'd seen Rome's wrath before. Your brother had already joined the fighters, his knife hidden under his cloak, and you feared you'd lose him. The city buzzed with tension, every conversation a debate, fight, flee, or pray for a miracle that might never come. The siege came in 70 AD, and with it, a nightmare beyond imagining. The Romans surrounded Jerusalem, their catapults and siege towers casting shadows over the walls. Food ran out within weeks, the markets empty, the granaries plundered. You scavenged for scraps, rotten vegetables, strips of leather boiled for sustenance. Your daughters grew thinner, their eyes dull with hunger. Stories spread of families fighting over crumbs, of mothers driven to unspeakable acts to feed their children. You'd heard whispers of cannibalism, tales too horrific to believe, yet the desperation in the streets made them plausible. You hid your family in a cramped cellar, the air stale, the darkness suffocating. The Romans tightened their grip, their battering rams pounding the city walls, their shouts a constant reminder that there was no escape. When the temple fell, it was as if the world ended. The Romans breached the city, their torches setting the sacred stones ablaze. You stood at a distance, watching the flames consume the Second Temple, the heart of your faith, your nation. The screams of the trapped mixed with the roar of collapsing beams, the golden menorah stolen, the holy vessels desecrated. You clutched your daughters, their tears soaking your cloak as the city wailed. The temple was more than a building, it was your identity, your connection to God. Its destruction was a wound that would never heal, a loss that echoed in every prayer. You whispered the Psalms, your voice breaking, as the smoke rose into the sky. Jerusalem was no longer yours, its sanctity shattered by the boots of conquerors. The Romans didn't stop at destruction, they looted and enslaved. Soldiers stormed your home, smashing pottery, tearing through your belongings. They took your wife's necklace, a gift from her mother, and your father's Torah scroll, tossing it into the dirt. You were spared death, but not slavery. You watched as your neighbors were chained, their children sold to traders bound for Rome or Egypt. You were marched out of the city, your wrists bound, your daughters clinging to you as you stumbled through the rubble. Jerusalem was a husk, its streets littered with bodies, its houses stripped bare. The Romans paraded their spoils through the city, the temple's treasures displayed as trophies. You were no longer a weaver, a father, a Jew, you were a slave, your future stolen as surely as your home. Exile was your fate, a scattering that tore you from everything you knew. You were sent to Egypt or perhaps Rome, your family separated in the chaos. The journey was brutal, the roads lined with the bodies of those too weak to continue. You carried your daughters' names in your heart, praying they'd survived, though you feared the worst. The diaspora had begun, Jews dispersed across the empire, their homeland a memory. You settled in a foreign city, surrounded by strangers who mocked your accent, your faith. You worked as a laborer, your hands calloused, your spirit bruised. Every night you whispered the Psalms, the words a lifeline to Jerusalem. Next year in Jerusalem, you said, a vow that became a prayer, a hope that sustained you through the darkness. The trauma of those days would linger, passed down through generations. Your children, if they lived, would grow up hearing stories of the temple, of a city lost to fire and blood. You taught them the prayers, the traditions in secret, because even in exile, your faith was a crime. The pain was a heavy inheritance, but so was the resilience. You clung to the Torah, to the memory of Jerusalem, refusing to let Rome erase you. The empire would fall one day, its legions reduced to dust, but your people endured. Through every synagogue, every whispered prayer, every story told in the flickering light of a candle, Jerusalem lived on. You wouldn't last a day in that city of fire and fear, not because you lacked strength, but because the weight of Rome's hatred was relentless. Yet your people did more than survive. They carried a promise through centuries, a flame that no empire could extinguish. Hey there. Before we dive into today's story, please hit that subscribe button, give us a thumbs up, and drop a quick comment below. It can be anything, where you're tuning in from, what you thought of the story, or even a suggestion for our next video. Your support means the world, helps our content reach more people, and we promise to reply to every single comment. We've reached the end of another tale, but if you're still wide awake and ready to keep exploring this journey of knowledge, check out the video popping up on your screen now. I'll see you there. Until next time,